Well, it seems rather unnecessary to have a moderator in this case. It seems to be a self-moderating debate, and don't be sure. Well, I listened to the first 10 minutes of the climate conference yesterday, and I will be here for the last 3 hours, and evidently I picked the good parts of it, at least according to Sten in this case. I'd like to give you the possibility to summarize from your viewpoints what's been said, but I have a few problems with this area as a physicist, and I mostly be following the area by reading the Economist reports on climate change. And one question a general question I would like to ask the panel is a bit of the role of IPCC. It seems to me that the peer review culture in this area is, well, not working properly, and a scientific area that should give advice to stakeholders not having a proper peer review culture as a basis for arguing is, to me, dangerous independent of what areas. I would like to have your comments. Is the way, I mean, having an IPCC to address the stakeholders, is that a dangerous thing or is it a positive thing in the development of the area? And in this case, also as a corollary to this is, Sten talked a lot about the stakeholders, and my question is, can you trust the stakeholders in this case? Can you trust the political stakeholders in this case? And my third input before I'll leave the word to you is, it seems that the definitions are used for me in some odd way. I mean, we use, everyone seems to agree upon global warming. I mean, that's sort of Fred does, I mean, everyone, but sometimes we use global warming only as global warming, and it should be caused by carbon dioxide, while global warming for me is global warming. And in a way that's has some importance, at least to me, because when you talk about change and taking precautions, is it actually so that we need to have carbon dioxide to blame, because that's something we could change as men or women in this case? We could really make changes that we believe that should change global warming. And if that's not the mechanism, then we didn't care about the precautions, I guess. Then we took the catastrophes as they come. And so I would like to you to comment on this coupling, I mean, between global warming and carbon dioxide. What's the importance, or what's the danger in this coupling or correlation? So please, the peer review culture and IPCC, and who's first?
I think this is simply the wrong format. If we continue in this, is this operating? Yeah. If we continue in this way, we will not come anywhere. So the questions you have raised, not the peer review, that's another aspect, but the other thing is just a question of yesterday or the day before yesterday. We should stop that. On the other hand, it's also boring. It's not boring for social scientists. For social scientists, it's really exciting. But for us as natural scientists, it's boring. The question is, there is warming, and some of us believe, and some believe that we have good reasons that this warming will go on because we have identified a cause. Others say, nope, I don't believe that. but I'm accepting that it's getting warmer. And then you possibly would say, oh, I'm expecting that this could change any time, because I'm not aware that there's a reason which would prolong this tendency towards higher temperatures. Okay, fine with that. So how do we deal with that? That's what we have to discuss. I mean, you have to say that we have a certain risk. I mean, I have a certain risk that my assessment is wrong. Okay, good. You have a certain risk that something is wrong. Good. So how do we deal with this uncertainty? I mean, that's what we have to convey to the politicians, that there is uncertainty. Politicians are very well adjusted to deal with uncertainty. They do it all the time. Only if they are not daring to take a decision, then they ask scientists to take the decisions for them. But that's not a wise thing. We shouldn't do that in any case. We just should say we are not fully agreeing. There are some people who are reasonable people who think there are some doubts, and others are reasonable in saying that we think the doubts are very small, and that's it. So we can discuss that over a beer all the time. It would be fun, and we can also hit on our heads in various ways. But in the end, the question is, how do we deal with that? And how do we deal with the uncertainty? Because this uncertainty will never go away. And so we have then to convey all this to the political arena, to the public arena, say, well, that's the arguments we have here, we've done that, and we don't need to decide that. We are not the parliament, we are not the world president or something of that sort, that we have to think about what to do. And an obvious answer is that we have to think about adaptation. And I must say these deniers, those I've seen here, are really boring, because they are not interested in also natural change. They're just thinking there has been how much ppm in 1942? 500 or so. Yeah, okay. I mean, this may be important for this overall debate, but in the end, we have to decide what do we do with the present warming? What do we do with the trends which have been described by Bengtsson, if they are continuing or not? That's the point we have to discuss. And we should stop to lead these old discussions from yesterday and the day before yesterday. Stop that. And maybe not everybody of you knows, but which means that what we need, all of us, is counseling by social scientists. We need not psychologists, but we need sociologists who tell us how is the dynamics of thinking, of perception. And in post-normal science, this is not the first case of post-normal science. Nuclear power business has been has been post-normal. Lots of environmental sciences has been post-normal. And that's the usual situation, lots of uncertainty, lots of stakes, bang. Then you immediately get these people who invent new mechanisms for storms. I mean, this is something you can predict. And the fact that we have the meeting here at an institute which has no, as far as I know, reputation for having done significant progress in climate and in meteorology, this is also just proof for this phenomenon that we're dealing with post-normal science. So what I suggest is that we invite a number of sociologists to talk about the analogies we have seen before, and then we may all walk out with our ears being a bit more red than now.
So the basis of poor science is not adding to the uncertainty in this case at all?
I didn't understand.
The basis of the poor science in certain cases, is that not adding to...
We had bad science. For instance, the hockey stick business was bad science. Had to do lots with this post-normal setup, had to do a lot with personalities. And if you remember this case of this Korean case recently, or this, oh, you're a physicist, right?
I'm a physicist.
This wonderful guy from Stuttgart. What was that? Was that failing of the review process in physics?
That happens
The
much
cold
less
fusion?
often in this
No,
case.
come on. This is exactly the same case.
No.
Somebody wanted to have the big
This
success.
is ridiculous. Yeah.
And so we have these failures in the scientific process all the time. And you have, of course, to show that we have it more often. We have it, quite clearly. But you also have this case I just spoke about. What was his name? This German guy who was in New York and then Schön. And then we had this guy in Korea. I mean, these are just two very clear cases. And compared to that, all our sins are really marginal, even Mike Mann's.
Okay. Next. Lennart.
Yeah, I will try to be quite concrete and try to answer your questions. I mean, I think we all agree that there is a global warming, and we have very good reasons to believe that that warming is outside the natural variability. We are, of course, not 100% sure about that, because it is based upon our knowledge of the dynamical system.
And it's also based on historical facts that it's been warm.
Yeah, but I
Yeah.
mean, whether this warming is something which is chaotic or
Yeah.
natural. But I think it is something which is outside our ability. And then, of course, the question, what is then the causes? Well, there we can only come up with a sort of a probability replies. We can come up with, we can list a number of possible opportunities for the causes of the warming, including volcanic eruptions, could hardly be the cause of the warming, of which we have the last 40 years, for example, where we had the two largest volcanic eruptions in the 20th century, in Chichon and in Pinatubo. So that is not very likely, I would say, to say the least. The solar forcing or the total solar radiation, this is, of course, still something which is debatable, as we have heard in this meeting, but certainly the measurement which we have now from satellites for the last 30 years doesn't indicate any trends at all. So this is hardly any likable possibility. The problem we have is really not the effect of the greenhouse gases, but what is the issue is the feedbacks. And that is, how the effect is being enhanced or weakened. They we still are dealing with a problem, but we have to do that for a certain time. And that determines the magnitude of the warming, which is actually at the order of factor of 2 or maybe even more. And in addition to that, of course, we have the whole problem, what will happen with the carbon cycle. So I think what I would say here, we have already a situation, and because of the potential irreversibility for practical reasons, talk about hundreds of years, it is necessary to try to do something about it. And furthermore, we really need to enhance the science in the area, because we have in no way been able to answer all scientific questions. And there's been a couple of new questions raised in this meeting, which we have to address. IPCC, finally, I mean, this was set up just to try to summarize the state of science. And I think that has been done, in my view, by many responsible scientists, put together reports coming out every 4th year with all the possibility to comment. And I see that has been a very helpful contribution to the decision makers in the countries. They are, of course, not perfect. They are open to some criticism. But I mean, they have done the best possible. And what could the else do?
So what you're saying that the advice based on IPC given to politicians is the best way of handling scientific
I think the other possibility is that the politicians are sitting reading their scientific papers, or they have a private advisor, or you have a national advisor in each country. You can certainly have that. That was common in the past. But I mean, they cannot really go to the media and ask for their opinion, or to the general public by asking on internet for what people think. You have really to have a group of experts who knows the problem. And I think in the committee which is concerned with modeling and data studies, I mean, these are certainly the best experts which we know about.
Many of them.
Many of them, yeah.
Not all of them.
No.
Okay.
No. Yeah.
Professor Singer?
I'm not involved in it. But I mean, I think this is...
We are not involved, so that's true.
No, we are not involved. And I think, I must say that they have done a very reasonable job. And I cannot, for any good reason, criticize on factual grounds the report that IPCC has come up with. There are, of course, economical interest by stakeholders which are concerned to maintain certain industrial activities, and it's understandable that they're not very happy about the situation. Certainly the representative of the coal industry doesn't like if there are some concern that their business may go down. But I think there are, of course, other areas of business will develop very rapidly to develop alternatives, and that I think is probably even more helpful.
Okay, could we leave the word to
Maybe
Professor Singer?
not entirely balanced.
Well,
I mean, there are others who have also vested interests, that are the reinsurers, for instance. The reinsurers are very active in the public arena, and of course it is not bad for their business if there's the perception in the public that risks may have changed. So one should keep that in mind, and one should also keep in mind, if you look at the large group of contributors to the IPCC, that there's a certain group of people who certainly have a tendency towards alarmism and who are actively involved in green movements. So, I mean, it's not so that it's really a sterile
Make it-
thing.
I
Okay.
mean,
Yeah,
I'm
but
interested
most
in
of them are
scientific
fine.
The word to Professor Singer.
I will make some very brief remarks about science before I go on to politics. I think it is important that we do discuss the political aspects of this business, because it is, frankly, much more than science, has become that, unfortunately. I suppose 100 years ago it would have been considered all science, but it is no longer. So, 3 quick scientific points to restate my views on this matter. Number 1, I believe that the human contribution to global warming must be real because of the increase in greenhouse gases, but it is minor, it's unimportant in relation to natural changes. I have seen no evidence to demonstrate otherwise, but I am open to such evidence if it should come about. Secondly, I'm constantly amazed to keep hearing people speak about the risks of global warming. Global warming is good. And I don't think I need to stress this point in Scandinavia. Only a few thousand years ago, this place was covered by a sheet of ice, several kilometers thick. And someday it will be again. And I think we're fortunate to be around at a time when the climate is reasonable. And as we heard in the first talk of this meeting by Fred Goldberg, 1,000 years ago, the climate was warmer than it is today, and people were happier. Scandinavians were colonizing Greenland. In Britain, they were growing wine grapes and producing, I suppose, a reasonable wine, which even the Romans enjoyed. Can anyone demonstrate to me that the present climate is optimum? I don't think so. The chance of that is minute. And if I had to choose between a warmer climate and colder climate, I would definitely choose a warmer climate. And I'm not the only one. Why do people from the north go to the south for vacations, and why do they move there? In the United States, North Dakota, Minnesota is being depopulated, and Florida and Arizona are growing. There's a reason for this. Certainly, ski operators may suffer some, but the net effect of a modest global warming is positive, based on studies by economists, reputable economists, who have published their studies in papers and in books. And they have numbers. And my third point, trying to do something about global warming or climate change is utterly futile. The IPCC tells us that in order to stabilize greenhouse gases, mind you, that doesn't mean stabilizing the climate, but just to stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we have to reduce emissions worldwide, not just in industrialized nations, worldwide, to by 60 to 80% from the 1990 levels. That includes China and India, and I think the chances of getting them to do this are very small. So I think we're beating our head against the wall. Mitigation is not an option. Energy conservation is always useful, particularly because it pays, it saves money. If you can do the same job with less energy, with less cost, you're better off, irrespective of whether you're concerned about global warming or not. That's irrelevant. And now to turn to the political aspects. Today is September 12. Yesterday was September 11. It's a very black day for us in the United States. It is obscene for me to listen to the President of the European Union, Mr. Barroso, telling the summit meeting, his summit meeting, that the big problem facing us is global warming. We must stabilize the climate and fight global warming. And now he tells us this on September 11. Well, unfortunately, he's listening to the wrong people. In Britain, you have the scientific advisor to the British government, Sir David King, telling us that global warming is a greater threat to humanity than terrorism. He's telling us also that by the end of this century, the planet will be uninhabitable except for the Antarctic, and there will be a few breeding couples who may be able to escape to the Antarctic and continue the human race. And mind you, this is the scientific advisor to the British government. It's unbelievable. Here in Sweden, you have Hans Blix, who tells us, after he was unable to find nuclear weapons in Iraq, that global warming is a greater threat to humanity than weapons of mass destruction, which includes nuclear weapons. Does he actually believe that? And this is the man the UN sent to Iraq to look for nuclear weapons? I mean, it just boggles the mind. Yeah. In the United States, we're not immune to this. We share the same madness that exists here. The state of Massachusetts has sued the US government to declare carbon dioxide a pollutant by law. It is not a pollutant by law at this time, nor did Congress intend it to be a pollutant. The case is now before the US Supreme Court. If perchance the US Supreme Court should declare carbon dioxide a pollutant, God help us all.
A question, I mean, in this case, so the difference is man-made or not man-made. That's the difference, the main issue. Could science solve that issue?
I addressed that issue in my talk today, yeah. And the conclusion I've reached, based on the data that are available, and the US government report published on the subject, is that the human contribution is minor and not easily detectable. And that the warming that is currently taking place is largely natural.
But obviously that's not a consensus, I mean, among science in this case.
I don't see how it could be otherwise, because everyone uses the same data. So I think if you look at the data honestly, to quote Stan, and frankly, then you must come to the same conclusion.
So you're not looking upon a way that you're prepared to take bigger risks than Sten and others?
I see no other way, but of course, if one can show me another way, I'll be willing to listen.
Professor Carter?
First, through you, Mr. Chairman, I would ask members of the audience and fellow panelists to desist from using words like denialists and alarmists. We all use these words in private over a beer. I do not think they contribute constructively to the debate. In those terms, I am unaware of anybody that I mix with professionally, whether they are largely a member of the group that believes human-caused global warming is a threat or not. I know nobody that denies that climate change is occurring. That point has already been made by Fred Goldberg. It's a very important point. That is not the point at issue. The point, as you said, Mr. President, is the degree to which humans may be causing any climate change that is observed. Your three questions, if I may take them in a different order, the first one was the role of terminology. What influence does it have on the debate? It has a huge influence on the debate at the public level. And the reason is, it's come up today already, that the word climate change is profoundly ambiguous. It is actually defined by one United Nations body as human-caused climate change. This is Humpty Dumpty behaviour. When I say a word is, you know, it's what I mean is. But the FCCC actually defines climate change legally in the terms of their United Nations Act as human-caused climate change. Happily, the IPCC has some rather more sensible people on it, and in their reports they are careful to distinguish between human-caused and natural climate change. That's not to say they can measure the difference, but they recognise the distinction, and I encourage everybody in this room to do so too. So your first question, is terminology important? It's terrifically important, because the public are constantly confused by that and other ambiguities of usage. A second question you asked was, can you trust the stakeholders? And the stakeholders are people like big power companies, insurance companies, politicians who wish to get re-elected, and especially green environmental political groups. My answer to that would be, in general, yes, provided you as a scientist can get to them before the propagandists have got to them. Unfortunately, as Professor Singer has just said, the politicians are listening to the wrong people, and so very often are the power companies, and so are the meteorological bureaus. So yes, you can trust the stakeholders. They're just like people in this room. They have their strengths and weaknesses, but in general, if you're dealing with them at a professional level, they are honest people, they are interested in the facts and using those facts to determine public policy or the policy for their company. The problem, however, is that they have already been propagandized. The third point you raised was, does the IPCC use proper peer review? Well, the answer to that is there's a 10-year history in the literature and on the web of criticisms being made of the way that the IPCC operates, and expressly of their poor peer review processes. One of the major problems which bears on the hockey stick is that an individual author, such as Michael Mann, can both write a large amount of a particular section of a technical report for the IPCC, and then that same person acts as the chief editor and decides whether, firstly has a hand in the selection of the referees, and then has some control, if not total control, over what referees' comments are incorporated. So I think the fair answer to that question is that many outside observers do not believe the IPCC uses the best possible peer review processes. That is not to say, and I agree with my other panelists here, that the technical reports of the IPCC don't contain a great deal of excellent summary and discussion on climate science. They do. I use them myself the whole time, but I distinguish sharply, as others have today, between those technical reports and between the policy for the summary for policymakers, which is an explicitly political document. If I could conclude by one comment only on the science, and it's this. I agree with every word that Professor Singer has said. I do not agree with a comment made by one of the other panelists that we all agree that warming is obviously happening. Not human-caused warming, climate warming. We have had papers at this meeting, including one presented by myself, which shows that that is an extremely complex question. The question itself is not simple, let alone the answer. The data discussed by Professor Singer from the satellite and radiosondes show that if you allow for extreme events such as El Niños and volcanic eruptions, then there is virtually no trend in the temperature data for the last 25 years. Whether or not T-Rex, the ground-based thermometer record, is a good record of temperature, because that's the one the public are using when they say, well, it's obvious global warming is occurring, is another highly controversial issue to which Professor Bengtsson, amongst others, has referred. So even at the most basic level of, is climate change at the moment, is the temperature going up or going down? That is not an easy question to answer.
Could I ask you an additional question to this? I mean, when I, as an amateur, looks at these curves, I mean, if I look at the last 5-6 years, I would say global warming stopped. If I look at the 100 years back, I would see a substantial global warming, and if I look 1,000 years back, I would see a random.
That is very good, accurate observation, and most of the audience who were present yesterday saw a presentation where I made that very point, that it's how long is a piece of string? What two endpoints do you wish to measure temperature between, and what length of period do you think is necessary for the resulting trend to be significant? If you believe 7 years is enough, then global warming is not occurring at the moment. The temperature has been static for the last 7 years, even slightly falling. If you believe 25 years is enough, then for the last 25 years temperature has been increasing, and so on and so forth. It is not a simple question, and it certainly doesn't have a simple answer.
Bengtsson.
Yeah, I think there is one additional question which I think is important to bring in here, and that is the time scale of climate change. I think all the studies which has been done and investigations, and I'm sure there are people here who totally disagree with that, but this has been done by very able scientists and many papers presented, and that is that the time of the residence time of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is quite long. And that means that, and also the inertia of the climate system at large, including the oceans. Now, this, of course, has the effect that we are dealing with a system which cannot be changed very easily. So we are taking not only a risk for what is going to happen the next 30 to 50 or maybe 100 years, but maybe for several hundred years. And that means that we all will have to take responsibility for that, because we are not answerable only to the people who are sitting in this room. We are answerable to future generations, because what we are doing now, someone else will have to take care of. And this is what we have to keep in the picture. And therefore, I think that all efforts should be made to develop intelligent system for generating energy, which is really the bottom line here. And I agree with Professor Singer, this is not easy. But I don't see this as a hopeless situation, because we know from history that we have solved problems, which were serious problems 100 years ago, and which are no problem today. And I think it's important to encourage young people, creative people, to develop new techniques for energy generation, and really try to take away the fear from, example, nuclear energy generation, which doesn't have this type of disadvantages.
Could
I think really one has to be constructive here.
Yeah. Could I ask you an additional question to this? I mean, this type of this argument is, of course, a very strong argument. I mean, if you put 700 years of future mankind on the shoulders of the present generation and stakeholders, I mean, you really think very carefully if you shouldn't take precautions. I mean, so it's extremely strong argument. If you turn the coin around, are there any risks with by taking precautions that this is carbon dioxide? So, or that's a risk? Is it a risk-free thing to take these precautions and presume that it is man-made?
I cannot see any risk whatsoever that we are more cautious with fossil energy, for example, and use it in an intelligent way. And I think the ambition which Sweden has in this matter is very commendable, I think. I don't know, they may be naive in some respect, but at least they are trying to do something about it. And I think that should be commended, I think.
Professor Storch.
Yeah, there have been two questions. Fred Singer said, well, why should the present climate be optimal? There's a very simple answer. Because societies and ecosystems are adapted to the present climate. Therefore it's optimal. Not in an absolute term. But we're used to it. That's it. And I think that's a pretty good answer, right? Second is, which time spans do we need when we consider trends? And there's also a relatively simple answer, namely, Of course, you can say I should not look after models, but if I think our theory is not crap, and our models are also not crap, then I would expect that, say, in the 1970s or so, the signal begins to emerge from the sea of noise. That is, we have to look at a trend which starts in about 1970 and until today. So that's very simple. It's not a matter of trends, but our theory is predicting when the trends are emerging, and so we should look after that. And so, I mean, it doesn't. It would be useless to consider a trend from 1200 or so.
But
now, if I just may have said these two rather simple answers, I think there's a consensus here, and I really thought it was interesting what Fred Singer was saying. Namely, he said, well, saving energy is a good thing because it's saving money. Well, maybe we should say it's saving resources, because money itself is not something valuable, but it's just an expression of something. But it's saving resources, and so it makes sense to save energy. And if it at the same time is serving a purpose what some people think is good because it's preventing some change in the climate system one would not like to see, then so why not? And if it is not the purpose, if it is not serving this purpose, then it's fine as well. We have saved energy. The second is, and that's what Sten Bengtsson's talk was about, that at the same time we have to reduce vulnerability. I mean, Sten mentioned that we are getting more and more vulnerable, and that is indeed true, also for Germany or so, that we are more and more vulnerable to the normal dangers of climate. And so it could very well be, if those who think we are seeing an ongoing change, ongoing because we are ongoing with the emissions of greenhouse gases, that these risks may become worse in future, may. If not, the normal dangers will remain. And then it's good if we reduce the uncertainties. So if I may use an analog, we are presently driving with something like, let's say, 160 kilometers per hour on the Autobahn, right? And with climate change, some of us would say we are driving 160.1 kilometers an hour. That's what Fred would say. And others would say, Kevin Trenberth would say it's not 190 kilometers per hour. Okay, that's the difference. But it is not the difference between 0 and 160. And so it makes sense to make this car more safe, whether Fred is right or Kevin Trenberth is right. So the task we are facing is that we convince people we must make our cars, so to speak, safer. That is the overarching, or one of the overarching policy requirements. And we have seen in the past that the public is not willing to discuss that at all, because some say there's no problem at all. So they are saying we are essentially driving with 0. And the others say it's unavoidable if we don't go reduce emissions drastically, that we go with 1,000 kilometers an hour. So that is all unrealistic. Let's go to the real issues, and that is what Sten Bengtsson has described so nicely.
Okay, 2 additional questions. If you look about the time span you state, I mean, if it fits the model, I mean, then it's times, or the theory fits its time, the time span is enough. What's the basis for this? Is just the time series, or the model must rely on geographical observation in tight grids?
I understand that there's a massive misunderstanding among chemists what such a model is. Sorry. This is not a regression model. I've heard that so often. These models are not fitted to data. When we have data, these data are used to validate the models, not to construct them. So this is a different type of models. These are dynamical simulation models. And so please don't misunderstand that. So these are based on some basic theories, and then also on some understanding of a number of processes. It is not a regression type model. It's not a statistical modeling.
Well, sorry about asking it, because in physics, when you started doing this, you couldn't get the semiconductor band gap to be a semiconductor for silicon. So I'm just interested in what stage the non-fitting or the basic theory is in this area.
I gave a full presentation on the status of climate model today, and they are dynamical models, very much built as the present weather prediction model, doing dynamic calculation of the physical equations of motion and thermodynamic equations and so on, and simply integrated forward in time, and having been tested and evaluated against observational data, So I think we are, and certainly in some remarks we have had here, they certainly incorporate, as I indicated very clearly, the transient cyclones very accurately indeed. So I think that we have reached a state where these models are performing very well. The problem with respect to climate change is some of these feedbacks which are related to clouds, which is a very serious problem. And we may have to live with the fact that we cannot do these calculations very accurately, but we can give a range of possible results. And that is precisely what is being done.
Yeah. And the conclusion, I mean, from your side, I mean, on the human influence is that we must lower the uncertainty by putting a lot of resources in to get the man-made component out of the climate.
Absolutely.
No.
Yeah. No?
No, absolutely not.
Aye.
I mean, to take political decisions, we don't need to reduce the uncertainty. You know, I mean, the main product of science is uncertainty. I mean, we are solving two problems, and we have 10 new problems. So it is not true, if we pursue science, that we are more certain after a while, but we are more uncertain because we have more questions. And the political process is entirely used to take decisions in the presence of uncertainty. That's why they are politicians and not technicians. So that's entirely okay. We should do more research. By the way, it's also fun to do research, and that's the best argument for research. But we should not expect that we ever arrive at the stages that we say we are now 100% sure, and nobody would deny that this or that theory is right. There will always be a few people who say, no, it is not right.
Sten
Okay,
Bergström-
last word before you. Oh, sorry, you're leaving. Sorry.
Sten Bergström demonstrated very clearly that I think it's necessary to make decisions on incomplete evidence.
Yeah. Okay.
And this
Professor
is what
Carter.
we have to live with.
Professor Singer first.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I wanted to continue 2 points raised by my good friend Lennart Bengtsson. One having to do with stakeholders. There's a myth going around that industry is somehow opposed to action on global warming. I wish it were true. In fact, industry corporations have figured out a way of making money on global warming, and particularly on emission trading, and have now become some of the biggest supporters of the idea of global warming at the expense of all of us. Look at the performance of Vattenfall. Look at the performance of E.ON in Europe. And you'll find out that they have made billions of dollars on wheedling emission permits out of governments. And they're actively promoting the further trading of emissions in order to make more money at the expense of ratepayers, at the expense of people who use electricity. It's very sad. But the other point made by Bengtsson is also worth following up on. That has to do with energy resources. I do not see a pattern, a clear pattern, on the use of nuclear fission energy. Oh, sure, there are those who still talk about nuclear fusion, but that's, you know, very far in the future. But fission is here and now and works. And that you find here in Sweden that Barsebäck has been closed down, both 1 and 2. The Socialist Party is divided on this issue. I don't know what's happened to Torbjörn Fälldin. Maybe he's still preaching against nuclear energy. On the other hand, in Finland, have building new nuclear plants. In Austria, Kreisky has persuaded the populace to vote on nuclear energy, and they have a perfectly wonderful nuclear plant that has never been put into operation. Just sits there like a museum. And then you have France. So, you know, I cannot see any pattern. However, it is an important issue, and an issue that needs to be addressed and hasn't been addressed at all. And as fossil fuels become more and more expensive, and they will, one has to look at substitutes for massive energy sources for electric power. I know there's wind power in Germany and Denmark, and
Okay,
but,
professors.
I don't think that is what we're looking for
Yeah,
when
yeah,
we talk
I know.
about massive energy use.
Okay, we could I just give the last word before you're leaving? Yes.
Yeah, taxi's waiting for us.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but it's only costing money, and the carbon dioxide is the.
Yes. Well, just to thank you,
Thank you very
for organizing this meeting. I mean, I think it has been quite a lot of interesting exchange of views, and we have learned quite a lot, I think. Hopefully, I have learned something. And I think that it's of course, most scientists are inherently very skeptical to what they are doing. This is a part of science. But on the other hand, I think that you have to realize that you have to have your figures right, nevertheless.
So,
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Let's have a coffee break before we go on. So.
Fred? My pleasure.
All right.